know me. And today we are very pleased to welcome all the way from down under in Australia, Dr. James Flexner, who will be presenting recent discoveries from the archaeology of mission sites in the Mangareva Islands of Polynesia. Beginning in 1834, a group of Catholic priests and lay builders established a mission in the Mangareva Islands in what is today French Polynesia. In subsequent decades, the missionaries and their Polynesian converts constructed churches and shrines on each of the main inhabited islands. Remarkably, this landscape of conversion and culture change remains largely in place today, however, in a state of ruination. James's talk presents the initial findings of a larger 4-year project investigating the archaeology of the Catholic mission in the Mangareva Islands. Archaeological surveys in November of 2022 documented dozens of 19th century mission structures. This research highlights themes of transformation, adaptation, and resilience during a century of dramatic encounters. So Dr. James Flexner is an associate professor of historical archaeology and heritage at the University of Sydney in Australia. He completed his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley in 2010, focusing on the archaeology of the Hawaiian leprosarium at Kalawao, Molokai. Since then, he has worked extensively in the Pacific Islands and Australia, including major fieldwork projects in Vanuatu, Tasmania, Queensland, and most recently in the Mangareva Islands of French Polynesia. From 2022 to 2026, James is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, focusing on the project Archaeologies of Community and Colonialism in Oceania. Thank you so much for coming to speak for us today, James.
Thanks, Pat, for that introduction and sort of teaser of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. So as mentioned, this presentation is based on my current main fieldwork and research project, which is funded by the Australian government, which I have to mention, as part of their funding, which is a 4-year survey and program of excavations, as well as archival and collections research, studying the 19th century missionary encounters in the Mangareva Islands. And one of the reasons that I say the Mangareva Islands is there is also a specific island called Mangareva. So it's a bit like Hawaii, it gets confusing because it's both a reference to a group of islands and a specific island. So this particular photo is on a point on Oceania Island, looking across to Mangareva and Taravai. And that's one of the kind of themes to keep in mind in this particular case, but in oceanic archaeology in general, is the ways that island environments were interconnected via the sea. And I'm sure, for those of you who work in Southern California, in places like the Channel Islands or the Santa Cruz Islands, this will sound like a familiar story, right? That the ocean was not this sort of impermeable boundary, but it served as a medium for exchange and as a resource for people, and continues to do so today. Mangareva is kind of well known within French Polynesia as being this sort of incredible fishery. And the contemporary Mangarevan people derive most of their livelihoods from the sea. Most of them are pearl farmers, which was a tradition that was actually introduced during the 19th century and an economic activity that really took over in the islands during that period of Catholic intervention and influence. Okay, so historical archaeology is well established as a major component of the discipline globally. It has a relatively long history, certainly going back to the 1960s, and arguably there are earlier instances. It focuses on, in much of the world, encounters between settler colonizers and indigenous peoples. In Oceania, the coverage of research in historical archaeology is highly uneven. So Australia, where I live, and New Zealand are major global contributors to international historical archaeology. They're both British settler colonies. People have been studying colonial sites since the 1960s. And there are, well-known major kind of monograph level publications of various kinds of sites, everything from missions to fortresses to sheep ranches. And so that's a relatively well-developed part of the field. In Hawaii, which is an illegally occupied territory in the 50th state of the United States, there's been sort of steady flow of research, certainly since the 1980s, and a reasonably active and well-connected sort of community of scholars. For much of the rest of the Pacific, and we'll see a map in a second to help people kind of work out where all these things are, there kind of is a really piecemeal approach to colonial heritage. And you could argue that the field is really kind of underdeveloped compared to many other parts of the world. So my own research and my colleagues, Matthew Spriggs and Stuart Bedford, have been working in Vanuatu during the last decade, focusing on 19th century missionary sites, particularly in the Southern Islands where the earliest mission encounters took place. New Caledonia has a history of sort of colonial heritage coming into focus and out of focus, often depending on what's happening in indigenous politics. So there's a very strong kind of Kanak independence movement among the first peoples of New Caledonia. And so when that becomes kind of politically important, people tend to go and back and look at these sort of colonial heritage sites as a material element of those histories to reassess what these colonial encounters and what colonial politics might mean for the present. But New Caledonia, nonetheless, like French Polynesia, is a part of France still and is treated as part of the what the French call the Pays Outre-mer, the sort of overseas territories. In Micronesia, the Solomon Islands, and New Guinea, these were all places where there were major kind of battles and events in the Pacific theater during the Second World War. So that's often been a focus of research, although recently my colleague Sandra Monton has been working in Guam on the earliest missionary encounters in the Pacific region, which date back to the 17th century, around the same time that the Spanish missions in California were kicking off. Again, that entanglement of political events and interest in colonial heritage comes into focus in Fiji. There was a indigenous-led coup in 2000 against the standing government, which was also an indigenous government. And there was a project at the now UNESCO-listed World Heritage Site of Lebuka focusing on that. And in many areas of the Pacific, there simply hasn't been investigation of colonial sites or colonial encounters from an archaeological perspective. Although that is, again, changing fairly quickly as more and more people get interested in the field, which is great because it makes me feel less like I'm just shouting into the void about what I'm interested in. So this is a map of Oceania. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on your screens, but I'm down here in Sydney, Australia. New Zealand, which I mentioned, is the largest archipelago in the Polynesian triangle. So you have New Zealand, or Aotearoa, as it's called in Maori, the land of the long white cloud, Hawaii, which will probably be familiar to some of you, and Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. Those are the corners of what's called the Polynesian Triangle. Vanuatu is this island group here. New Caledonia is that big island is the Grande Terre. New Guinea up here, and the Solomon Islands, and Micronesia, these little dots up here. So we could spend a whole hour just talking about oceanic geography, but we won't. Because I have far more exciting things to talk about. So this triangle represents the approximate boundaries of the territory of French Polynesia today. For reference, that's also approximately the same surface area as the entire European continent. So talking about a massive swath of sea and islands that have been interconnected throughout the 1,000+ year history of human occupation in the region. Mangareva is the group of islands down here in the southeastern corner of French Polynesia. And in its pre-contact history, Mangareva was kind of one of the stepping stones as people left central Polynesia and started to travel outwards, eventually reaching Rapa Nui and eventually actually the west coast of South America. But again, that's another story for another time. Just zooming into the islands themselves, as you can see, there's a group of, so Mangareva's geological history is that it's an ancient and now extinct caldera, volcanic caldera, surrounded by a fringing reef, which has these motu, or coral islets, around it. That beautiful kind of turquoise water that was in the opening image was taken from the point just here on Oceania. And you can see there's a sort of central lagoon that these islands sit in, which again is an extremely rich marine resource for the people who've lived in the islands during the last 1,000 years. Currently, the main center of occupation is the village of Rikitea, which is located here. That was the seat of the so-called royal family, who we'll hear about in a moment. The islands throughout the group have evidence for occupation since about 1000 BP, but currently most of the population is on Mangareva Island. The smaller islands are occupied by a few families or not at all. So these are the 4 islands that I'm going to talk about today, which are the main islands where missionary construction took place during the 19th century. So as I said, there's evidence based on high precision uranium thorium dating of a coral abrader from one of the rock shelters for the initial discovery of these islands by Polynesian navigators around 1100 BP. It seems like that wasn't the large scale colonization. It was simply someone finding the islands, visiting, figuring out, where they were, and then going back to tell the people in their home island all about it. And then a fleet arrives probably 100 to 200 years later, and you start to see evidence for large scale population expansion and transformation of the environment. The indigenous culture of Mangareva develops during that period of the last 800 or 900 years. And then European encounters begin at the very end of the 18th century with the visit of the ship Duff. So, one of the few groups of islands in the Pacific that wasn't mapped or, quote, discovered by Cook. They weren't a major kind of focus for European colonization or settlement for a few decades because there weren't, it's sort of off the beaten path. It's not a great sort of center of resources. It wasn't majorly productive from an agricultural perspective. There's a limited number of perennial freshwater streams. So a few whalers kind of coming and going, but not a whole lot of larger scale interactions. Until 1834, with the arrival of Père Laval and Carré of the Pères des Sacres Coeurs de Jésus et Marie, the Sacred Hearts Fathers, also called the Picpus Fathers for reasons that I still don't know, but if anyone has ideas about that, I'd be interested to hear them. That really began the European colonial settlement and transformation of life in the islands beginning in the 1830s. The French Catholics, for a little bit of context, end up in Mangareva because they're not at that point able to establish a foothold in Tahiti, which was the more populous and more sort of desirable location, because the London Missionary Society had arrived and established their mission in the 1810s, 1820s. So when the French Catholics arrive, you know, the Anglicans are already there to tell Pomare, who's the king of Tahiti, you know, don't listen to these guys. They're devil worshippers and they're crazy, and, you know, they're going to ruin your islands and bring misfortune on all your family and friends. Send them away. So they end up about 2,500 kilometers southeast of Tahiti in the Mangareva Islands to establish the first really major Catholic presence in the region. So within a few years of missionary arrival, you have the construction of the first stone buildings, which were a major feature of these mission landscapes and still are. So in addition to priests, there were a cadre of frères bâtisseurs, which are Catholic lay builders who were specialists in stone construction, who were explicitly brought to the islands to build up the infrastructure of a Catholic mission. There is, during this period, also the conversion of very high chiefly individual called Maputeoa, who is referred to as the king by the Catholic priests, and there's the establishment of a royal dynasty and royal lineage associated with Maputeoa. Ironically, he was initially against welcoming the Catholics and against conversion, but because of some rivalry between Maputeoa and his uncle Matua, he eventually kind of decided that following the Catholic way was a more sensible way of sort of consolidating his power within the islands. Over the course of the 1840s to the 1860s, construction continues to be very widespread. There are schools established on Oceania and Mangareva, which I'll show you in a minute. One was a girls' school on Mangareva, and then on Oceania was the boys' school. So, you know, a very Catholic sort of keep the genders separated by a relatively well-known and easily navigable canoe passage. So I don't think anyone really prevented anybody from, you know, sneaking out to see their girlfriend at night, but it was an attempt anyway. And the other thing that accompanies missionization throughout Oceania is the introduction of essentially capitalism. So the adaptation of Mangarevan people to introduce labor patterns, and I already mentioned the introduction of pearling as a major activity. In the 19th century, actually usually not for the little spheres that we like to string and wear around our necks, or some of us do, but actually for mother of pearl. So that's the actual shell of the pinctada mollusk, which people use for things like buttons and inlay in furniture and lots of other decorative purposes, which was a major 19th century commodity. And there were also introduced crops like manioc that replaced or augmented the traditional Polynesian crops of breadfruit and taro and yams. By the 1870s, people are also building timber structures, possibly, although this is a matter for future research, including prefabricated kits that could have been shipped from places like Australia. which became common during that period in, towards the end of the 19th century across the region. But stone houses remained inhabited throughout the 20th century, and in fact, a few examples have been renovated and are still inhabited by Mangarevan people today. So that's enough history. Let's move on to archaeology. So I've currently documented about a little bit over 100 structures. As you can see from this table, most of them, the most common type of structure is a stone house or cottage. But there's also churches. There's a main cathedral in Rikitea. There's bread ovens on every island because, French people they can't live without bread. So that's a common kind of feature. There's some school structures, a series of towers that were built as watchtowers for the royal family and their entourage. And in some cases, traditional structures, such as marae or stone temple platforms that lie under missionary buildings. So we'll see a few examples of those as we go. I'm going to go through and basically just go island by island, focusing on a few of the more remarkable features from each place. So this is the island of Akamaru, which was where the initial missionary settlement took place in 1834 at the Bay of Tokani. Again, there's a Polynesian settlement here when the missionaries arrive that's been documented previously by Marshall Weisler and Roger Green, whose names will be very familiar to any Pacific archaeology fans out there. But within the settlement, they built the earliest of the stone cottages, which you can see here, along with two of my local research assistants. If you've been in academia long enough, it seems like the freshmen get younger every year, but anyway. So this is kind of typical of the stone buildings that were built by the missionaries from the 1830s onwards. They're both cut limestone coral blocks and volcanic cobblestones that are fused together with lime mortar, which would have been created by burning shells, obviously, locally. Eventually, this is augmented with ingredients like Portland cement, but that doesn't come in until the kind of 1880s, 1890s. And these buildings are in varying states of conservation. This one's pretty good. But as we'll see, there's various states of ruination, and that's part of the project, is working with the French Polynesian government and the local government of Mangareva to try to establish better processes for the long-term conservation of these features, because it is a really remarkable set of colonial landscapes, but hasn't received enough sort of attention in the past. Eventually, the Catholics decided that Tokani was too exposed to the inclement weather, heavy rains and high winds, and strong currents that come from the Pacific Ocean in the direction of the southern part of the island. And so they established their main village on the other side, on the coastal plain, on the north side of the island. They built a landscape along a cruciform sort of layout. So these two white lines essentially follow the main avenues that are in the Catholic village. The east-west running or longer kind of line has a series of stone cottages and other buildings built along its axis. And then the north-south running axis connects the original 19th century pier, which is still in use today, with the pathway up to the 19th century cemetery, which I won't have time to talk about, but is another really amazing site with legible headstones dating all the way back to the early 1840s. And then this blue circle, which I also don't really have time to talk about, is a traditional Polynesian agricultural field system that was never recorded before. So, archaeology abounds in the Mangareva Islands. You're tripping on it everywhere you go. but we'll focus on the buildings that are in this, this cruciform village, starting with the series of buildings that lay at the crux between the two axes, which is the very large church of Notre Dame de la Paix, and the associated missionary structures, which you can see here. So this is, as I said, the church of Notre Dame de la Paix. There is associated with it a presbytère, or priest's house, or presbytery, if you want to use the English version, a separate kitchen building, a toilet block. Adjacent to the kitchen, there's a little set of steps down to a spring house. And then this bread oven, which is one of my favorite features in the entire islands, which is built of two enormous volcanic boulders. This thing's about 160 or 180 centimeters across. The lower one has been flattened to provide a surface, to bake the bread on. And the upper one has been hollowed out into this dome that's placed on top to retain the heat. And there's actually a little chimney hole in the dome to let the smoke from a wood fire escape while you're baking. So adaptation of local materials to colonial projects is another one of those common themes around these kinds of missionary sites. These are examples of the stone cottages, again, to show you kind of the variation both in form. So for example, different kinds of false archways built with little, ionic column type, embellishments, but also that the conservation is really variable. So some of the facades are nearly intact. Some of the buildings have, ginormous trees growing out of them that are pushing everything over. Some are completely overgrown with vines. And so there's a big kind of work to be done, not only to record these structures, but also to come up with long-term conservation management plans to ensure that they continue to exist and be visible for future generations, both of Mangarevan people and of visitors from other places. This is one of those examples of adaptive reuse. So this is the largest house on the island. It was built, depending on who you talk to, either for Maputeoa when he was visiting or for Pères himself. Either way, there's a Mangarevan family who's moved in, replaced the windows, added electricity, and not quite running water, but some things like running water. It's just a way that people have taken these structures and brought them into, everyday life in the 21st century in these really remote islands. And these are just a couple of examples of that cemetery that I mentioned with the really early Polynesian headstones. And of course, these are, a lot of these people will be individuals whose families are known, whose lineage is known. So it's a really important site for connecting local people with that heritage. Going to the neighboring island of Oceania now. So this is that tower that was visible in the opening slide, just from a different view. This is from a boat passing by the island. As I said, Oceania was the location of both a missionary settlement, which focused on this Church of Saint Raphael, which was actually the first one completed by the missionaries, but not consecrated until after the main cathedral in Rikitea, which we'll see in a minute, was consecrated. The neighboring presbytère or priest's house, this is an example of again, a fairly typical thing the Catholics did in their mission activities, which was to build on existing sacred sites and sacred landscapes. So this is a very large marae platform. It's about 20 meters by 12 meters in surface area. And these are massive boulders. These are all kind of 80, 90 centimeters across. And there's the 19th century stone masonry structure on top here. and then 2 additional houses in a row past that. This is the boys' school. It's a 2-story structure. It's very large. It has classrooms on the wings and probably office space / classroom / mess hall on the ground floor. And then you can probably see here a scar leading up to a 2nd floor, which was the boys' dormitory. So it's a very kind of centralized way of being able to surveil who's coming and going out in and out of the school. And these are just a few different details, including that vertical scar for the stairwell and the beam slot where the stair would have gone in. And also scars representing probably shelving or cabinetry. So again, that colonial introduction of surveillance and documentation of everything is a big part of the process of modernization around the world. And then a lot of the structures, not just here, but elsewhere, have had this kind of local graffiti dating across the 20th century from when after these sites were abandoned. Next to the school is another bread oven. This one made remarkable by the presence also of a limestone millstone and a volcanic boulder that has a rectangular groove that's a slot for that millstone to process wheat for flour, but also things like seeds for oil that was then supplied the rest of the island with food. And again, it's the combination of religious education, but also education in particular patterns of labor that's a major part of the missionary project. Oops, wrong way. The neighboring island of Taravai had its own missionary cluster, including this kind of amazing stone arch with the eponymous Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary on it. So a lot of the islands, the main landing places that were established by the Catholics in the 19th century remain the main landing places as people zip back and forth, these days on motorboats rather than sailing boats. But it is quite common inter-island travel throughout the islands even today. So this is the cathedral and of Saint Benoit or Saint Benedict, and you can see local conservation is ongoing, but it tends to be kind of piecemeal and ad hoc. So in 2019, when I first visited the islands, you can see there were these blue details, but the facade is starting to get quite moldy, and the plaster is peeling. So someone's come in, built scaffolding, started to replaster, they'd torn apart the inside. But they kind of do bits and pieces when they have a little bit of funding from the church or the French government, rather than a concerted effort to really take a holistic approach to conserving these structures. These are some of the tiles from the church, which were replaced with corrugated metal. Again, sometime in the last few years. The tiles were made by a major tile manufacturer in Toulouse that's commonly found across the French Empire. This is that archway that I mentioned. We know because there was a survey of 19th century buildings done by the cadastre, the cadastral office of French Polynesia in the 1980s, that the left-hand side of the arch has fallen down. And someone has added a coat of whitewash and repainted the part of the hearts in between 2019 and 2022. So again, these are still actively maintained, a lot of them, structures, particularly the religious structures. Finally, and I realize I'm kind of getting close to my time here, the main island of Mangareva, as I said, this is the village of Rikitea, which is where most of the population lives today. And this is the Cathedral of Saint Michel, which is the largest, was and is the largest structure in all of the islands since it was built in the 1840s. The cathedral is said to have been built on a maison des idoles. These were these sort of display houses for monumental wooden carved figures called tiki. It's said that when this was destroyed after the missionaries arrived, they built first a church in temporary materials and eventually this large stone masonry cathedral on that site. And I haven't been down there because access is a little bit complicated, but there's a crypt under this cathedral, much as you get in a lot of other French Catholic and generally Catholic cathedrals, that has a series of kind of stone alignments and things that are probably part of a traditional Polynesian structure, in addition to being the burial place of several French and Polynesian Catholics. Adjacent to the cathedral is an évêché or bishop's house, which is this two-story structure, as well as a presbytère, a priest's house, and then a third house in a row, which was built for Maputeoa, who again is the king's uncle and one-time political rival. These are on the, if you're facing the entrance to it, these are to the right of the cathedral. To the left and closer to the sea is this long building, which interestingly is marked as a Maison pour les Frères Tisserands. That's a house for the Weaver brothers, who would have been responsible for making clothing for the colony. Both probably things like religious vestments, but also just everyday clothing that people would have worn while they were going about their activities. And then even closer to the sea, there's a royal compound that was inhabited by Maputeoa and his family and his descendants eventually. Unfortunately, much of this compound was destroyed during the 1960s and 70s when the local primary school was built right in the middle of it. But they have retained an archway and several of the towers that were built for the royal family, as well as this large stone enclosure that served both as a landing place for large sailing canoes and as a fish pond for a traditional form of Polynesian aquaculture to provide protein for the royal household. Up the hill from the royal household, there's also this massive megalithic pit for fermenting breadfruit, or ma in Polynesian, Mangarevan, into a kind of fermented paste called popoe, which is a bit of a acquired taste, shall we say. It can be kind of funky, you know, you essentially mash breadfruit up and just leave it open to the wild yeasts and bacteria in the air. And it was both a means of preserving food, but also adding a bit of interest to the diet. So think of it like, much like you know, the French or the Californians for that matter would use blue cheese. You know, not everyone likes it, but it does add some interest to your you know, and variety to your diet. And popoe remains a sort of beloved ingredient and dish among Polynesian families who still live in Mangareva. And then finally, nearby at the district of Roru is a site called Le Couvent, or the convent, which was actually the 19th century girls' school rather than being a place for religious women. And you can see there's several structures on the site. Again, the Catholics built archways everywhere they went. You got to have an archway, otherwise how would you know where to enter somewhere? There's actually two more of these megalithic breadfruit pits in the couvent. And then adjacent to one is a structure that I've interpreted, at least on one side, as being a kitchen and dining room, on the basis that there's this, you know, large scar that pretty obviously represents a fireplace, hence all the burning. And interestingly, around the fireplace, I don't know how well this is visible in the photos, but there's this mural that is essentially designed to look like a Greek Ionic temple. So you have columns, you have those scrolls from the classic sort of Ionic architectural order. There are amphorae. There's a row of amphorae on top of this little molded cornice here. And so, you know, someone painted this sort of European classical motif. And it's a sort of, I think, a reference to the sort of mythologized origins of European civilization in the classical world as encapsulated in the space of Roman Catholic girls' education. Oh, and this is just a de-stretch enhancement of that image where I think you can see a couple of things like the amphora and some of the columns a little bit clearer, as well as, again, some of the ubiquitous graffiti from these kinds of sites. There's a separate structure, which is a probably the chapel for the girls in the school. And then, as on the other islands, there's a series of these houses, stone houses, some of which have been buried in quite a thick layer of soil, and large-scale erosion and mass wasting has been a problem actually throughout the human history of Mangareva. So that's another one of those sort of conservation challenges that faces these structures. We found a few artifacts during the survey. What we would call in kind of Americanist historical archaeology whitewares, including sponge stamped, which is quite a common decorative technique in Polynesian assemblages. The French call this somewhat confusingly faience, which, you know, Anglophones used to refer to a particular kind of Egyptian stuff. But anyway, there's also some manufacturers' marks. This from a pottery, a French pottery in this case in Bordeaux, J. Vieillard, which is there's sherds of this stuff also in New Caledonia and in other parts of French Polynesia. And finally, on one of the domestic sites, we also found the bottom of a Singer sewing machine, which would be from the early 20th century, and again reflects people's sort of ongoing adaptation of new forms of material culture as they came into the islands over time. So that's it from me. I'd like to say maro inui, or thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions.
I have a couple questions for you, James. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I was wondering, how much they know, about the social, interactions between the native population and the French immigrants during the mission period.
So the answer to that is a little bit, but that's going to be a big sort of aspect of what the project is doing. So I've just hired 2 postdocs who live in French Polynesia, who've been working in the French National Colonial Archives in Aix. And they found this really interesting correspondence that kind of parallels what the missionaries have written, because there's published missionary accounts, excuse me, by Père Laval and also by one of these Frères Bâtisseurs who wrote a sort of story about his time in the islands, which are fairly sanitized, shall we say, versions of what actually happened. If you go to the government archives, what you see is this series of complaints about the Catholics sort of abusing native people, right? There's accounts of people being tied up and flogged and sort of, you know, really violently kind of reprimanded for not complying with what the Catholics expected in terms of people's behavior. So I think there's probably a complicated and actually fairly dark history that we're starting to uncover about how some of those interactions worked in practice.
So was there like intermarriage? Do they know, like you said, there was
No,
late
and
people
in
that came
fact,
and helped build and,
yeah, I mean, so not with the Catholics. And in fact, the Catholics were horrified. There's this amazing account by this Frère Baptisseur, whose name is escaping me at the moment, who said, the first night that they arrived, they were greeted in traditional fashion, traditional Polynesian fashion, by the royal family. And of course, part of that Polynesian welcome includes an expectation that, you go off with one of the local young women. And the priests ended up having to run away and hide in the rainforest because it was, that obviously breaks their vows if they go along with that. And there's accounts of the Polynesians kind of getting out torches and hunting for them in the dark, going like, you're not really here until you do this. So, the Catholics would have been very sort of horrified at the idea of intermarriage. Now, of course, at the same time, there are French traders and whalers and people like that who would be more inclined to go along with that sort of a welcome. And there are, long histories of intermarriage between Europeans and French Polynesians. But it's not the main part of those interactions in Mangareva. Because most of the European colonial socialization came through the Catholic Church.
right. No, you said something about the mistreatment by the Catholics of the native people. So that kind of connects to my other question was if like in California, they forced the Aboriginal peoples to convert and to work at the missions, basically, enslave them. Did that also happen in this area?
To an extent, but in this case and in a lot of Oceania, that dynamic was also colored by Polynesian chiefly authority. So once Maputeoa, who's from the highest ranking lineage in the islands, converts, everyone kind of has to convert because the king converted. Does that make sense?
Right.
So there's still a lot of coercion, and there's obviously conflict there. But it's I would say it's probably more the chiefly power that kind of drives that dynamic than the Catholics. Although the Catholics were then instrumental in introducing particular patterns of labor and productivity and worship and those sorts of things.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sim, you've got your hand up.
Thanks for calling on me. Thank you for the presentation and for the little end of the day tour through some beautiful scenery. I'm not familiar with the marae. Is that like a heiau in other places? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So marae is probably the more ancient term. Heiau is a unique Hawaiian language innovation, I guess. Okay. And there's some weird things about Hawaii. Hawaiian's a bit of a interesting outlier in Polynesian religion, but yeah, throughout Polynesia, the term marae is used to it really refers to sacred space. So okay. Sometimes it's a stone structure and sometimes it's actually a clearing or an open space where, spirits or gods live.
Gosh, well, I was going to ask a different question, but I want to continue on this thread. I mean, so the building on top of these spaces is one thing. Are there places that are just totally off limits that you're encountering? As missionaries are starting to enter this landscape, are they directed towards certain places and not others, or?
The answer to that is I'm still wrapping my head around it. There will be that kind of stuff. So there are, for example, one of the places the missionaries were directed away from was a particular marae on a high point in Mangareva. It's on the saddle between the two highest peaks in the islands, which was where high-ranking, chiefly males would go sort of to finish their education before moving into positions of authority. And those structures are still there. They were sacred enough that they weren't touched. Other stuff was adapted. So there's I didn't show it in the presentation, but there's a volcanic boulder with this massive natural basin in it. And traditionally, it was where high-ranking dead people, their bodies were put there until they became defleshed. And in that process, it was believed that the spirit would leave the body and go to a particular sacred islet off Taravai. And that has been kind of re-mythologized during the missionary period as the bain de la princesse, the princess's bathtub, where the princesses of the royal family ostensibly would go to, wash their hair or whatever. So those the sacred geography and sacred landscape of Mangareva is still there. But as with so many things, it's going to be about that process of sort of peeling off that layer of colonial imposition and understanding, what's there. And there's a young Mangarevan guy who's doing his PhD at the University of French Polynesia, who I'm working with, who is very interested in sort of place names and meanings and the connection of things like, village locations to particular places that had stories associated with them. So yeah, that's going to be an ongoing and I think big aspect of the research.
Yeah, sorry to push you. I know it's early days in the work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll be eager to hear what else happens. And thank you for the adding interest. I like that. I think Patricia has a couple of questions
You have
too.
a couple questions?
Yep.
I think it's this, Patricia.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Is there still an active Catholic presence in the Mangareva system?
Yes, although I would say, like in many areas of the world, it's probably an aging Catholic presence in terms of the people who are really sort of devout worshipers. So the cathedral in Rikitea is still used. They do services every day, 3 times a day, and mass on Sundays, and then all the high holidays. And then the churches on the islands that have fewer people, so Taravai, Akamaru, and Aukena, those get used on particular religious festivals, especially the Saints' Day festivals associated with the patron, or in Akamaru's case, matron saints associated with each of them. So yeah, still quite active. But it's the 21st century. All the young people have smartphones and TikTok, and they're on the internet. So interest in faith seems to be dwindling somewhat among the kind of newer generation. So that's going to be an ongoing kind of interesting process of the kind of the secularization, I guess would be the right word, of these places. And that's kind of ubiquitous across French Polynesia, really.
And my other question, you mentioned several times really large boulders. What technology existed for people to be able to move them?
Well, in the in the French side of things, they would have had, the typical things that were available to any medieval builder who worked in stone. So levers, pulleys, simple machines. In slightly cruder terms, as I was asking one of my Hawaiian friends about this for some structures that I was working on during my PhD, and he said, "Oh, you just get some big brothers and you lift them up." So, at some point, brute muscle force can also move very large objects if you have enough people and enough willpower.
So there wouldn't be any evidence. I mean, it would have been hand labor or ropes made out of native material that wouldn't have endured. So there's no real physical evidence.
Not so far. There's a chance that when we start excavating in the next few years, we might find some kinds of tools. I don't know of any evidence for something like blacksmith, which would be kind of you might expect given how remote this area is and how much building they did. There is a blast furnace on Oceania for mass production of lime mortar. But in terms of just the construction of these buildings, I think mostly the apparatus to build them up would have been organic materials and relatively simple manual processes as much as is possible.
Thank you. There's another question up.
Anybody else have any questions for Dr. Flexner tonight?
Looks like Sim has a question up.
Oh, Tim?
I was just wondering about beasts of burden to help move the boulders around too, livestock. But if there's time, I have a question about. So are we talking on? Is it one missionary stationed at each of these little places, or is it? Are there multiple missionaries on each island? And I wonder if you got into some of the documents that might sort of speak to some being more favored than others, and some being viewed as more lax or more, as Pat was saying, are there more that are a little more by the book in terms of what the mission's going to be about?
I haven't done a lot of research in that area, but generally there was one missionary, one priest on each of the smaller islands when possible, and then usually 2 or 3 on Mangareva. And of course, eventually what you get is you get a generation of converts, and you get the first Mangarevan priests who, in some cases might be just as zealous or even more so than the French ones. And I guess the other thing to keep in mind is often the missionaries came and went, particularly as they moved higher within the Catholic hierarchy. And when the Catholic sort of presence becomes more widespread. And there's also, so subsequent to Mangareva, there's a very large mission in the Marquesas and eventually in Tahiti. And interestingly, actually, the main cathedral in Papeete, which is still the seat of French colonial power in the region, was built by Mangarevans. So in the 1860s, the Catholics in Mangareva send a delegation of about 60 Mangarevans to Papeete to build the cathedral, because they're sort of known as master stonemasons at this point. They're still Polynesians, but they've had now decades of training from some of the French master masons in how to build, and they're expert in building with the local materials that are available in Polynesia. So yeah, there's some great stories of mobility. There's interesting stories about the personalities of these people. I just haven't been able to dive into them in a whole lot of depth.
Well, geez, James. Just kidding.
Get onto it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All good. And I'll just note, if anyone's interested, I'll pop a link into the chat. The first paper on this, oops, that just went to Sim. The first paper on this has come out in the Journal of Pacific Archaeology recently. Although logging on it looks like it's got I don't know what's happened. Someone appears to have put the wrong title on the website. Yeah, that's probably a weird system thing, but the right title is on the paper itself. If you go to the PDF, which I'm not sure if it's open access. If it isn't open access, you can just email me and I'm happy to share copies if anyone wants one.
Lovely. Well, given our current weather, it's been wonderful to have a little trip to the islands. So
Yeah, I've been seeing lots of pictures of snow from my friends back home in North America.
Week after week of rain, yes.
Yes. I have another quick question. So I found the fermented breadfruit pits to be pretty interesting. Now that's a Polynesian food. Now you said fermented, so is that an alcoholic like substance?
Depending on the yeast, there would probably be some alcohol, but not like people weren't using it as a psychoactive substance. It's fermented more in the sense that like sauerkraut is fermented.
Oh, okay.
So it would be, I think, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it would be a lacto fermentation rather than an alcohol fermentation, if that makes sense. They did have, so what they would have had is kava, which is a psychoactive plant from the pepper family that actually originally domesticated in Vanuatu, but was ubiquitous across Polynesia. And that was a root that was ground up, mixed with water, and then drunk usually only by sort of elite males on special occasions. And that was probably in Mangareva. I'm not sure there's direct evidence for it at this point, but yeah, it would be weird if it wasn't there. It's pretty typical in the Polynesian crop suite.
Did the priests have any wine or anything that they used?
Yeah, so Sim mentioned livestock. I'm not sure exactly when cattle were introduced, but that obviously would be a French introduction. There's goats as well, and the Catholics planted various kinds of fruit, trees and vines, including grapes. So yeah, wine would have been there for both religious use, but also for social occasions, shall we say.
Seems like wherever you go, there's something that people like to use for some kind of mind alteration, enjoyment type of thing. Oh, interesting. Anybody else have any questions tonight?
Well, maybe on that note, given that it's Friday afternoon / Thursday evening, it's time to go and find a festive beverage of some description.
There you go. Well, I'd like to make a couple quick announcements here. We have on April 13th, we have Julia Costello, the owner at Foothill Resources here in California, will be speaking for us. And May 11th, we have Caitlin Brown, who is a postdoc fellow at UC Santa Cruz, who I believe will be speaking about her work at Mission La Purisma. So I hope you folks will join us for our upcoming talks, and thank you so much, James, Dr. Flexner, for speaking for us tonight. I think you are our farthest away speaker that we've had. I mean, the other side of the world, you know, other end of the world, you can't get much further away than that. So thank you so much for giving up part of your Friday afternoon, and enjoy your beverage and your weekend coming. And thank you so much. It's very, very interesting.
Thank
All right.
you.
Friday, James.
Thanks for having me. It was nice seeing everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Very much so. Okay, good night,
Bye.
everybody.